Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Ezekiel, that's in chapter 10. And it is a continuation from chapter 8 in the vision that Ezekiel was brought to the temple to see all the idolatry and abominations. And then in chapter 9, yesterday, we saw that God had given the prophecy in the vision that he will not listen to the cries of the people in the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and there was a prophecy that they will be destroyed. Now, by way of review, I just want to highlight a couple of things which I may not have been clear yesterday. In chapter 9, as we begin, in verse 2, in this particular vision, we see 6 men that came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north. And this depicts the eventual destruction that will come from the north. That would be Babylon. Now, there are 6 men, not seven, 6 men, and one of the men was clothed with linen and a writer's, well, not exactly inkhorn, but a slate for writing at his side. Now, that is how it started yesterday. And when it ended, it was also in the focus of the man clothed with linen with a slate at his side, and he is supposed to look for the righteous people to mark with an X. Now, we also noted that this idea of marking in verse 4 to put a mark on the foreheads of men. This idea of put literally means to cause to mark or make a mark. Now, the second word here in verse 4 is tav. It is not mark. And this word tav is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, this is the modern tav, and the ancient letter is actually written with a cross stick, like an X. And so all of these, putting a mark literally is to make a visible X or a cross, which is the letter Tav of the ancient Hebrew letter, onto the forehead. We continue in chapter 10, and it begins this way. It says, and this would be, and then Ezekiel looked. Now, much of everything we see in these few chapters is about a vision. And visions are to be seen, observed, and in many cases to be understood. Now, what is important is that they are all visible. In chapter 10, there is a repeat of what he saw in chapter 1, and we will take a look. He says there in the Rakia, and this is the word Rakia, and you can see this in chapter 1, there was above the head of the cherubim appeared something like a sapphire stone, a blue stone, right? A blue stone having the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Now, let me just redraw this. This is a cherubim. And then above that is a rakia. A rakia is actually a thin veil, a thin, how should you say, a thin platform or a thin covering, right? Maybe a covering is a good word. A thin covering. And what he sees is that there appears to be a throne-like structure. A throne-like structure, something like this, let's say. And this would be what we see as a throne-like structure. In verse 2, he continues. And then there is this person, whoever, then this God, spoke to the man clothed with linen, and this is one of the six. And he's a special one with linen. And of course, he has his little slate. And then said to him, he says, go in among the word wheels is gal. Now it's important for us to continue looking at these words in the same way as it is written. The word wheels is gal. And I will retain it here, right? Gal. And I'll just write down here, gal. And this is equivalent to the ophanim. And they are angels that spins around, right? That spins around, and it's filled with eyes all over. So just bear in mind, and we'll come back to this, the gal, and we will see more of it later on. Under the cherub, it says, fill your hands with coals of fire from among the cherubim, and then scatter them over the city. And he went in as I watched. Now, this is actually told to the man clothed with linen. Well, we need to actually explain some of these words which are not quite clear. It says, fill your hands. This word, fill your hands, is cupped hands. Cupped hands. And what do you mean by cupped hands is you have both hands and you actually have a hollow in the middle of the cupping. And so it's two hands put together, and the coals of fire from the cherubim is going to be placed into the two hands that is cupping together to hold the coal. And then it says here to scatter. Now, the scatter is actually a good word to use. It is to toss, sprinkle. Basically, it is not merely throwing. It is to spread it over the city of Jerusalem. And then he went in, and then this man in linen went in, and I watched. Now, this is the setting of chapter 10. So bear in mind, verses 1 and 2 is actually a summary of everything that's happening in chapter 10. Verse 3 begins the narrative, of which verses 1 and 2 was a summary. It says, now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple, and the man in linen went in, and the cloud filled the inner court. Now, understand that the temple is always facing east, and there is the inner court. And so what we have in the cherubim would be here. The cherubim is saying that it is standing on the south side. Now, it's important for us to understand all the directions. A person in the Hebrew sense always looks east. Always looks east. That's the bearing. The right-hand side is also the south side. The left-hand side is the north side, and the back faces the west. And so the south side is the right side of the temple. Hence, you find it right here, the right side of the temple. When the man went in and the cloud filled the inner court. Now, what do you mean by cloud? This should be understood as the presence of God. This is the inner cloud. Now, clouds actually depicts the presence of God. And God exists in the clouds, right? And these are all dark clouds. And when they are dark, it's just that you can't see through them. You can read this in 1 Kings chapter 8. And when Solomon was dedicating the temple, the cloud of God was inside the temple. Now in verse 3, he has moved to the threshold, and then he is moved into the inner court. What we are beginning to see is the step-by-step motion of departure of the Shekinah of God, of the glory of God. Verse 4. And then the glory of the Lord went forth from the cherub over the threshold of the house, which is the temple. And the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. Now, this word brightness means the glow. The glory of God is hidden in the clouds. And all you can see is it's dark, and then you can see the glowing in there. And that depicts God's glory. Verse 5. It says, and the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard in the outer court, and it sounds like the voice of El Shaddai. Now, this word here, Almighty God, is El Shaddai. When he speaks. Now, we don't know how God speaks and how it appears. And so these words that's given to us in the book of Ezekiel chapter 10 tells us that the sound of the wings flapping of the cherubim sounds like how God speaks. Verse 6. And then it happened when he commanded the man clothed in linen, one of the six, but this guy is a scribe with a tablet, and saying to him, take the fire from among the Galgal. Remember, I just want to maintain this name first. Galgal. From among the cherubim. That he went in and stood beside the Galgal. Verse 7. And then, after verse 6, and then the cherub stretched out his hand from among the cherubim to the fire that was among the cherubim, and took some of it and put into the hands of the man clothed with linen, who took and went out. So what we have now is that we have a man that walks in, takes the fire, and then walks out. The cherubim appear to have a form of a man's hand under their wings. To give you an idea, if this was the cherubim, you find hands, human-looking hands under the wings. When we get to verse 9, we are beginning to review what Ezekiel saw in chapter 1. This magnificent vision of the chariot of God, and then above the Hayat and the Ophanim, when he looks up, there is a rakia, a covering, and then above the covering would be a sapphire stone with a person that looks like God sitting there. And so in verse 9, it says, and then when I looked, there were four wheels by the cherubim. The four wheels is the Ophanim. Now you notice there's a play of words here, the Ophanim. So we have the Galgal, translated as wheel, which is also the Ophanim, where the angels were spinning around by the cherubim. And it says here, one side to the wheel, one side by one cherub, another opha, right? This is a ophan, one ophan, another ophan by each other cherub. So the ophanim appear to have the color of, well, it says here in the English, the beryl stone. It is actually appearance that looks like crystal. I guess you could say Tarshish. This is what the Hebrew word is. We don't know what some of these are, but it is a precious stone. And as for their appearance, all four looked alike, as if it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now, what does this mean? It is actually an ophan in the middle of an ophan. So we have the appearance of two consecutive wheels. And each of the consecutive wheels will have eyes, and it spins around. And so just understand that these are what we will call the ophanim. One is called an ophan. This is singular. And ophanim would be the plural. And that's what these are. An ophan and in the middle of another ophan. Verse 11, when they moved, they went toward any of their four directions. They did not turn aside when they went, but followed the directions the head was facing. They did not turn aside when they went. Now, again, I remind us to review chapter 1, because the movement of these angels really went the way they wanted to, and they didn't need to turn. They just happened to move very quickly and stop and change direction as and when they move their head. And their whole body, with their back, their hands, their wings, and the ophanim. Now, this word here, the ophanim that the four had, were full of eyes all around. As for the ophanim, they were called in my hearing wheel. Now, understand this. The word wheel here is Galgal. So we have Ophanim were called Galgal. That's basically what we're saying, that Galgal is the same as Ophanim. In verse 14, we continue to see what we saw in chapter 1. Each one had four faces. The first face was the face of a cherub. The second was the face of a man. The third, the face of a lion. The fourth, the face of an eagle. And the cherubim were lifted up. Now it's time for me to introduce another equivalence. The cherub and the cherubim is the same as the chaya at singular And the Hayat, that is a plural, right? The plural. And they are also Cherub, which is the singular, and the Cheruvim, which is the plural. These are all interchangeable. That's why in chapter 1, when I said they were angels, that's how we would understand it in chapter 10. This was the Hayat I saw by the canal of Kebar. Now, this is important because this is a mirror description of chapter 1, verse 16. And when the cherubim, in plural, moved, the Ophanim was beside them. And when the cherubim lifted their wings to mount up from the earth, meaning to rise up, the same Ophanim did not turn from beside them. They were sticking beside the cherubim. When the cherubim stood still, the Ophanim stood still. And when one was lifted up, one means the one cherubim, the other Ophanim also lifted up, for the spirit of the Hayat was in them. So there is a movement that you can see that they're all living. We come to verse 18. Now, verse 18 begins by saying, and then. All of these up here is the magnificent vision, or similar to chapter 1. And then after this, after seeing the movement of the Hayat, the cherubim, and the Ophanim, which is also called Galgal, the glory of the Lord, which is the Shekinah, departed from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. Now, verse 19 needs a little bit of explanation. Verse 19 basically said, rose from the surface. Now, what does that mean? It rose, this word mounted up from the earth, literally means rose from the land in my sight. So now we have in front of the temple, this is the threshold. And the glory of God was seen there. So we just draw it this way. The glory of God is seen there. And then he moved up above the cherubim. And then as it was above the cherubim raised itself up. What does that mean? It means that this is the ground and it moved upwards. That's what it means. It moved upwards. Still in the inner court. When they went out, the Ophanim was beside them. And then at the end of verse 19, he says, and then they stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house. What does that mean? It means this. At the inner court, there is an east gate. And the glory of God stood there. Now, the important thing of all these wordings is the movement has moved from the what we call the Holy of Holies, and it moved to the threshold, and from the threshold it moved to the above the cherubim, and from here they moved to the door of the east gate, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. All I'm trying to depict in these pictures that I'm drawing is the little movement of how God is inching out of his house. Verse 20. This is the Chaya I saw under the God of Israel by the river Kevar, and I knew they were cherubim. This was the vision that he had in chapter 1, remember? There was a rakia, and then there were the four cherubim called Hayat, and then there were the Ophanim. And then above that, based in chapter 1, there was a blue throne that was above them. And then there was a vision of God that the lower part is filled with fire and it was all burning. Now, that is the imagery that he saw in chapter 1. That was the magnificent vision. And so in verse 20, Ezekiel is saying, hey, I knew that these Hayat, which they are called then in chapter 1, they are all cherubim. I knew they were cherubim. And how did they know? How did Ezekiel know that they were cherubim? Well, the idea of cherubim appears in Genesis chapter 3. God used the cherubim, which is in the plural, to protect the tree of the knowledge of life, so that the man and the woman cannot come back to access it. So cherubim is part and parcel of the knowledge of Ezekiel. Verse 21. Each had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings, and the likeness of the hands of man under their wings. Verse 22, and the likeness of their faces was the same as the faces which I had seen by the river Chavar, and their appearance and their persons, and then they each went straight forward. Now, what this means is they moved head on. They would go in the direction as they face. So if they face this way, they would just move forward. They don't turn. And this basically telling us that the cherubim or the hayat, together with the galgal or the ophanim, the way they moved is straight. Wherever they turn, that's where they go. They do not turn like a car. They just move very staccato, very, very, it's like an immediate change of direction. Where they move their head, they will be moving in that direction. And so that is what we are left with at the end of chapter 10. It is a continuation of Ezekiel's vision at the river Chavar, now in the temple, that he sees the glory of God inching out from the Holy of Holies to the threshold to above the cherubim on the south side or the right side of the temple, and now moving to the door or the gate on the east. Tomorrow, when we continue with chapter 11, we will see more of this inching movement of the glory of God. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.